Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Samuel Zinner in the mountain village of Aula, Italy. Welcome to Just Nowhere. Today we have a very special guest, Professor Dean Rickles, University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you for being here, Dean.
Welcome.
Yes, your work, most people are going to be aware of if they haven't read your publications, of course, going to be from online interviews. And there's your interview, a very short one with Mr. Kuhn, right, Closer to Truth, on the
Mhm.
question of, well, it seems a lifelong preoccupation of his. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's
Mm.
it's it's a very intriguing interview, but of course all too brief. But that's of the nature of the format of his show. But I wanted to try to start off with that basic question, but to try to probe some of the details, right, at greater
Mhm.
philosophical and perhaps even like scientific or cosmological depth. So
Mm.
you pointed out rightly that in response to a question like that, the universe is an instance of being rather than being as such. So we're immediately right. We're in the realm of what philosophy calls ontology. And the next point that you made, of course, is to point out, I guess, the general view that the question itself, uh, one can assail it as involving a circular. It's a circular logic question, and so let's start off
It,
with.
it,
Can you go over why that is susceptible to the charge of being a circular?
yeah,
Um,
it can be circular. I mean, it depends on how you're viewing what an explanation consists of. So obviously, the way the question is being posed, it looks like any other question, any other explanation
sure.
seeking a question, where you would expect as a response a set of premises and a conclusion, the conclusion of which would be there is existence or being or something like that. But obviously, because of the nature of the thing that's being explained, which is
Mhm,
a totality, it's everything.
mhm,
It must logically include what you have to put in the premises to get it out. So
mhm.
it's always going to be there's always going to be a circularity in that sense. There's no premises of any argument that you could put in that would get out being that wasn't already included in being, given the nature of being. That's the circularity.
Yes, I know there's another semantic problem involved in this subject because the nothingness, right, of physics, right, for instance,
Mhm.
Krauss's
Mm.
quantum foam, right,
Yeah.
is does not coincide with philosophy's notion of absolute nothingness, right, and in fact,
Yeah.
for a physicist, there can be no absolute nothingness. It
Yeah.
they don't go there. It's just not logically fitting. It's not coherent, which I guess from some philosophical angles um, actually would probably be congruent, right, with the old Aristotelian notion of the eternity of the world, right? So it sort of bypasses one of the logical problems there. And I know that George F. R. Ellis, right? I don't know if you've heard it, but it's online. His 2012 Copernicus lecture, where he
Mhm.
really takes Lawrence Krauss to task, right? For
Well, it's easy to do.
not for being a bad physicist, but for being a bad philosopher, right?
Yeah.
So, um, but he points out, Ellis points out that strictly speaking, just from a scientific point of view, the point of view that physicists operate from, when we look at the so-called Big Bang, right? This, of course, right, is not actually the beginning of the universe in the physics models. There's something that happens before, right? And there are different theories about that. Inflation is a popular one, though it is increasingly contested. But we'll see where that goes. But
Mm.
his main point, I believe it's the same one I think that Sabina Hassenfelder has recently made, and that is right. You do reach the limits of the scientific method and where science can probe at a certain point, and beyond that, it just seems that to go further back, right, which is metaphorical way of speaking, right, to go before the before, which is really a bizarre thought in itself. One then has to really rely on philosophy, analytical philosophy, and theology also goes there. But I would imagine good theology is going to have to be based on good philosophy. And
Yeah.
so Ellis ends up pointing out that we really can't know. Certainly at this point, we don't. And perhaps in principle, we can't even know uh, if there was actually a beginning. Right?
Oops.
So the eternal model remains a possibility, right? So this
Yeah.
is
I
where
mean,
he ends. So how would you
yeah, there's
react
some
to
interesting, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting history of cosmology on this question of the beginning. So there was a famous debate in the 1950s,
that?
1940s and 50s over this Big Bang theory because a lot of physicists thought that it precisely left too much scope for religious elements to creep in.
Mhm.
So there was a competitor theory known as the steady state theory, which is an
Yes.
eternal theory. It says that there's just been this expansion and constant creation, so sometimes called the constant creation or continuous creation model, has just no initial point at which it happened. And we can explain all of the same kind of expansion that we see using this model without needing this strange initial, almost like a genesis
Mhm.
point, where everything emerges from. We don't need it in physics, and it leaves too much space for a creator. And obviously, you have to remember that that Big Bang model was developed in the first place by a priest, by Lemaitre, a priest
Right.
at MIT. So who knew perfectly well the theological implications of the Big Bang model when he came up with that model.
Mhm.
Um, So, but there are, I don't know whether we necessarily need to view it as a boundary. I mean, it's a boundary on present knowledge, but it's not a boundary on whether we can consider models that could go beyond the Big Bang.
Mhm.
There are a whole bunch of recent approaches. There are some from string theory. That
Yes.
there's a model called Big Bang string cosmology, where it uses certain mathematical properties of strings, this thing called conformal symmetry, to show that as you get smaller and smaller, you go through the Big Bang boundary and you sort of come out the other side. There's a sort of strange development like that. Roger Penrose has a very similar
Mhm.
theory of conformal cyclic cosmology, which uses the same mathematics essentially. This idea of conformal symmetry, where you can't tell the difference between large scales and small scales,
Yes.
basically.
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
so Penrose's idea is that as the universe goes towards its end, and everything becomes this kind of thermal radiation, it sort of becomes photons, and photons don't have mass. And if you
Mhm.
don't have mass, you don't have a scale. So that allows him to do this strange sort of rescaling of the large to the small, and he starts what he calls a new eon, basically. So he has these very yeah, sort of eternal recurrence kind of eons that happen. But he
Mhm.
thinks that you can find evidence for it you would be able to find evidence in the background radiation, the cosmic microwave background radiation, because there would be concentric circles. And I mean, he thought that they'd been found at one stage. They
Mhm.
haven't. That it's
Right.
still not got any empirical support. So there's a whole bunch of models. There's another one called the ekpyrotic model of some guys at the Perimeter
Yes.
Institute in Canada, Turok and Steinhardt, I think, Neil
Mhm.
Turok. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can attack the problem of this beginning and show.
Mhm.
But as you were saying at the beginning when you were talking about Krauss's notion of nothingness, all it would reveal, I expect, is that that wasn't nothing. It's not creation from nothing. there's something else going on. It's happening in a larger structure, right? Because all of these models are taking place on the assumption that there's a quantum vacuum.
Mhm.
And a
Mhm.
quantum vacuum is about as far from a nothing as you can possibly get. It's a seething, constant bath of energy and motion,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yes.
Lawrence Krauss's whole idea is that you utilize the energy in that quantum vacuum, and you utilize this thing called the Heisenberg energy time uncertainty relations, which say that if you've got a small enough um, duration of time, you can have very large energy fluctuations. If you take it right down to the tiniest, then you can have huge energy fluctuations,
Mhm.
which could include the fluctuation that becomes our universe.
Yes.
So that's very
Well,
obviously not a thing in the
yes.
philosophy sense, as you say.
Yes. Yes. Well, yes, plausible enough, right? His theory, but where it breaks down, as I've already intimated, right, is then when he says, therefore, right, we have no need of a theological model, right, because we
Mm,
can now explain how we get something from nothing. And the main
yeah,
category error there is that what theology or religion means by nothingness is not what he's talking about, right? So,
exactly.
yes. Yes. So, in any case, so do you think that I know she's quite popular now on YouTube, but Sabina Hassenfelder, do you think she's being a little too harsh when she calls these various theories like Penrose's, the one you mentioned, and there's a plethora of these theories that go, quote unquote, before the beginning. And she just says
Mm,
these are not falsifiable. They're just not. They're all scientific. Right, is the phrase that she likes to do, to be a little kind, I suppose, rather than call them pseudoscience or just religion. But she calls them basically all scientific because they're not falsifiable. I see the problem right away with Penrose because he does have at least an
yeah.
argument that where in principle, right, there is a falsifiability, a conceivable one. He thought he found it at one
Mm.
point, but it wasn't really confirmed. But and
Yeah, I think go on.
well, the as for string theory, um, I listened to a debate, if you will, between various physicists featuring Max Tegmark. And the consensus of this, and this is something I found on YouTube, and of course, if you haven't heard it, you can't speak to how I will be characterizing it, but the basic gist of it was, and it was explicitly suggested that maybe we should jettison Popper's whole requirement of falsifiability since we can't find any real evidence, proof for our whole, the string model, the string theory after so many
Hmm.
decades. And so maybe it's time to jettison, this notion of the requirement of falsifiability, which I think is just absolutely, an act of desperation. And this is right, an online thing. It's not in a, I'm sure they probably wouldn't go there in a peer reviewed, publication, but this is what they're actually suggesting in their how would we call it, their among friends speaking as
Hmm.
professionals
Mm.
though. So
Yeah, well, I mean, look, so in the philosophy of science, Popper's methodology is not considered to be historically accurate. It's been found to not describe how scientists actually
all
operate.
right.
They don't go around trying to falsify
Mhm.
their theories. Very often, they will work with inconsistent theories for a while if it works. Like, Rutherford's theory of the atom was known to have this problem where the electrons would spiral into the nucleus if they're continuously emitting radiation.
Mhm.
But you can still work with it for a bit. So they will generally adopt whatever works, regardless of whether it's falsifiable, for a while. And there's this idea of obviously the most famous recent methodology of science is that of Thomas Kuhn, which is
Yes.
it's kind of falsificationist, but it
Mhm.
says it takes a little bit of time before you build up enough tension with the
Mhm.
world and with the background theories before you say, okay, that one is now on the scrap heap. We'll get rid of that one now.
Yes. Mhm.
But there are other elements of theories as well, which I don't know. They seem to sort of escape. um, escape the tendrils of falsification anyway. So if you've got other reasons to believe in a theory,
Mhm.
and that theory has other implications,
Mhm.
then you have sort of secondary reasons to believe in those implications. So one common example is Newton's idea of absolute space. So you can't
Yes.
observe absolute space, but what you can observe are a whole bunch of other features of the theory that are empirically very well verified. His laws of mechanics work very well. His law of gravitation works very well. The only way for it to work, however, is that it has this underlying assumption of an absolute space. So you can sort of access something that's invisible
Mhm.
by looking at things that are visible and using the logical connections between the invisible and the visible bits. So there might be something similar going on in some of these proposals that are being
Mhm.
put around, where they merge well with, for example, quantum field theory and what we know about cosmology, and maybe
Mhm.
they have these other implications. I mean, so
Sure.
one example of this would be the multiverse, or the idea of an ensemble of worlds.
Mhm.
So there you mentioned inflationary cosmology. One of the implications of that theory, if true, would be the existence of these kind of pocket universes that have different constants of nature and things like this. Again, we're not going to see that. We're going to be confined to one particular pocket. But the theory has it as an implication, and we have reason to believe the theory. So we should have reason to believe the implications, regardless of whether they're observable or not.
Mhm.
So there are cases that can be made that you're not necessarily violating falsifiability. You're saying that there's things that go beyond falsifiability,
Mhm. Mhm.
as how I would
Well,
put it.
well, getting back to your brief interview, at least the excerpt from a longer one, I suppose that you had with Kuhn, you got to the subject of logic and numbers, right? So in any possible world, we would have numbers, logic, right? And George Ellis, in his 2012 Copernicus lecture, he also right tries to go before the beginning, right? But he doesn't
Hmm.
do it through the route of physics. He then relies on logic and philosophy, which he seems to be better at than some of his colleagues, right? But so as you know, he talks about the various possibility spaces, right? So the possibility space of logic, right? And so I think a subset of that would include numbers and numerical structures, especially. But also he also talks about the possibility space for the laws of physics. I know that's a big subject.
Yeah.
Are they descriptive or merely or right? And also the possibility space of morality, right, which is very intriguing. And he, of course, he doesn't confuse morality with cultural bound systems of ethics, right, which can be
Hmm.
flawed and be different, but morality in these almost like law-like.
Cosmic.
Yes, what's right and what's wrong, right? So, different cultural systems of ethics, have some, can some of them will permit various forms of birth control, others don't. But everyone agrees you can't go out and start killing people, and if you do, there are consequences. So this is what Ellis means, right, by the distinction between
Hmm.
morality and ethics. And of course, I know it's a matter of semantics because not everyone is going to subscribe to his terminology, but I think they may have, the same basic idea. So he goes before the beginning, and what he sees there is this what he calls the possibility space, right? And so
Mm.
there you can have mathematical structures and logic. And now that takes me to a question I want to pose to you about going back to Tegmark, right? His theory of the mathematical universe, right? So, um, how how can how is this the naysayers? What are their arguments um, against Tegmark's mathematical universe? That the mathematics is not necessarily merely describe the universe, but that's what the
Mm.
universe is. Are you aware of cogent
Yeah.
objections?
Yeah. I mean, there's one primary objection, which is so Tegmark's view is he has this hierarchy of ensemble hierarchy of possible world scenarios.
Mm,
So one is similar to the one we mentioned in the inflationary cosmology. There's the quantum mechanics one. There's I think it's the string landscape, and then there's this radical approach, which is all possible mathematical structures. So you're
mm,
talking about probably the level 4 multiverse, which is all possible mathematical structures. Obviously, what characterizes, and this is the problem, what characterizes a mathematical structure is that it's not concrete. So
yes.
this is why in the interview with Kuhn, we were talking about the fact that numbers are necessary. And the reason why they're necessary is because they're not concrete. They're not pinned down to concrete reality. So the standard objection for Tegmark's view is that we appear to be in a concrete reality here. So there's this mismatch between concrete structures and abstract structures. So that's the objection. I mean, Tegmark has a response to this, which is that there are in this mathematical universe, there are self-aware substructures which feel like they're concrete beings. It's almost like a kind of that they would be in a simulation or something like that,
Mhm,
where they feel like they're more than simple abstract mathematical structure, but within the structure they're not going to know any different.
mhm.
So I mean, I don't know what you think about that as a response. I don't know what other response he could give other than that response.
Right. That's
And you could make the same objection. You know, Berkeley and idealism face exactly the
mhm,
same kind of objection.
yes.
If reality is just the mind, ideas, possibilities like this, well then I can go over here and kick a stone and refute you as Dr. Johnson
Yes.
did, but it's not a refutation because we're both in the system, in the same system. Right,
Right.
the rock is an idea, his toe is an idea, the pain is an idea. And it's the same
Yes.
for these self-aware substructures in Tegmark's
Mhm.
mathematical universe.
Yeah. There's another model I find more plausible, at least philosophically, and I think just from the point of view of physics, and that would be, and it's again, there's some. It's not a finished system yet, but that's Nima Arkani Hamid. He wrote a book with several colleagues on like the uh, Grossmanian matrices, but the popular lecture that he gives, there's various instantiations of it on YouTube, is the end of space-time. And his basic spiel, or the basic trope is this, is that we start off with gluon interactions, right? So two gluons can interact with a single one can alternatively interact with two, right? So you start with these triadic structures of gluons, and these begin to amalgamate, right, form amalgamations. And he points out that one of these single, if you look at the amalgamation, but if you zero in on one of the single triadic blocks, if you will,
Mhm.
these lack space-time and quantum mechanics. Right? But if you look at the amalgamation at this point, then we have space-time and quantum mechanic properties. And so his general hypothesis is that mathematical structures, that is, the various combinatorial permutations, the various ways the gluons can react, um,
Mhm.
are generated, may generate space-time quantum mechanics. So we get to our physical material world being generated from what he calls mathematical structures, the various possible permutations of the relations between these gluon amalgamations.
But
And
how does he view his gluons and the
well,
forces between them?
well, he doesn't really go into much detail in his public lectures on this, but of course, there's a lot more detail in the book that he wrote on Grossmanian matrices. But his the way he sets it up is this, right? Says to get an idea of these permutations, right? To think of it mathematically, or let's set up a row of
Mhm.
integers 1 through 5, 1 through 6 at the bottom on top, right? We're going to have another set of the same numbers. And let's say number 1 on the bottom is then going to interact and meet up with 4 at the top. And, so you get these crisscrossing interactions and all the various ways this is going to happen, right? It immediately looks like a combinatorial situation in mathematics.
Mhm.
So he's saying, I don't believe that he would confine this just to the gluons, but this type of combinatorial possible permutations, right, is what these mathematical structures are, which he sees as the way to get to space-time and quantum mechanics. And so the title of his popular lectures is a bit odd to me, because the end of space-time is really, I think, talking about how do you get there?
Yeah,
So he's
yeah, the
explaining
the
space-time,
emergence of space.
right? But the end, I can see his point. The end of space-time, what he really means by that is, all right, so if we're working backwards, so how do we
Mm.
explain the origin of it? Because before the origin is not there, right? So in that sense, the end of space-time. So there, his argument is different from Tegmark's, insofar
Mm.
as he has the mathematical structures generating, right, the concrete, right, level of a cosmos. So just apart from the physics of that and the unfinished part of it, which he acknowledges they're not quite there yet. They haven't explained how you can generalize this, but right, because it's really, you have those two sets of integers, so that's one dimension of space and one dimension of time, right? So you have to be able to
Mm.
generalize that to the actual world we live in. But logically
Yeah.
or philosophically viewed, that's my question. That does that make more sense, right? That mathematical structures could generate concrete objects than
I
Tegmark's model.
I don't think so because it almost reminds me of that probably the most famous Sam Harris cartoon where
Mhm.
he's doing an equation on the blackboard and then he says, and then at this point a miracle happens. It's the
Ah,
idea of how do you what point do you go? Is there a discrete switch from abstract to concrete where it gets a certain when it has a certain complexity? That's when, just then. I mean, I can't unless they can show that,
mhm,
and I
right,
don't
right.
see how possible that they could show that. I mean, there's a similar problem with it sounds very similar to Raphael Sorkin's causal set theory, where you start with what are essentially space atoms, and you imagine sprinkling them in a certain way, and they've got certain causal relations, and that's all.
Mhm,
And they have the same problem, which is the continuum limit. How do you get to the continuum limit where you have the thing that looks like the space time we inhabit?
mhm.
And they don't have a response for that still. And I think there would this other approach you're mentioning would face the same continuum limit,
Right.
i.e., they would not be able to demonstrate that continuum limit.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
I don't think so.
Right. Yeah, I personally agree with you. It has the same point you're making there, I guess, could be expressed in synonymous terminology, right? There's an explanatory gap
Mm, mm,
remaining, and that has not been filled, and it's somewhat analogous, perhaps, to the it's ubiquitous in the field today, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Right, there's this explanatory gap, and my friend Gregory Chaitin, the mathematical philosopher, the way he
mm,
explains this is, we're really hard pressed to if we start from let's say consciousness is fundamental. If we start there, we're hard pressed to explain the origin of matter, and
yeah.
turn it around. If we start from the point of view of materialism, then we're hard pressed to explain the origin of the non-concrete of consciousness. Though there are a lot of theories that try to do that, but as far as
Mm,
I'm aware, there's always this explanatory gap, and
yeah.
and the like emergent consciousness and all these various theories are possibilities. Sure, I granted that, but I don't think that anyone has really explained it. I think the latest attempt. I don't know if you've read the paper Lahav and Nima on a relativistic theory of consciousness, and they have this grand claim that we have solved we have answered the hard problem of consciousness. It seems that almost every paper, right, has this theory, this claim these days, but it's basically taking Einstein's theory of relativity, right, and so we have the first and third person consciousness being compared to the different, let's say the twin paradox, for instance, involving time dilation. So time is passing at different rates, right, for two different individuals. So these are compared to the first and third person. It seems to me that this theory merely describes the first person and third person consciousness interaction or relationship, and is not really telling us, what really is consciousness, the functions, the origins. It's just, it seems a good analogy, creative, innovative, but I don't think by any, I just can't imagine that it's solved the hard problem of consciousness. But it
Yeah,
seems,
I don't think.
yeah, it seems that all theories are there. There's an explanatory gap. So this brings me now to another subject that you've dealt with, and that is the whole issue of time and the block world. The question of the block world. Yesterday, I did an interview with a block world proponent, Veselin Petkov, right,
Oh
at
yeah,
the Minkowski Institute
Montreal.
in Montreal.
Yeah.
All right, so you know his work. Now, his argument is that actually, like the kinematic effects of special relativity, like the Lorentz transformations or the Lorentz contraction, for instance, of like a meter stick, for instance, or the time dilation, right? That neither of these actually, the dynamical explanation really doesn't make sense. Like the idea that we can explain the deformation, right, involved in the Lorentz transformations dynamically. He would say that the coherent explanation there would be that actually what is happening is the difference in the measurements would be the result of your measuring two different slices, two different 3D slices of the 4D world tube of the meter, right? And that this makes, well, he wouldn't say it makes a lot more sense than the dynamical explanation. He actually rules out. He says there's no way you can explain the Lorentz transformations or time dilation through dynamics, right? Apart from a 4D model, right? So, do you have any thoughts on that claim?
Yeah, I don't really know enough about his particular work on this
All right.
subject. I mean, I do know that there was an old debate about how to interpret the Lorentz transformations. I mean, in the beginning of the work on what became special relativity, there were a set of well-known transformation equations that both Lorentz and Poincaré and Einstein were utilizing and giving different interpretations. So the initial approach by Lorentz, who found those transformations along with Fitzgerald, was a dynamical explanation. And it was basically an ether-based interpretation. When things move through the ether, they feel a certain force. There are inner atomic forces that compress in the direction of motion and any object. So you can interpret one of the same set of equations like that, or like Einstein did with this geometrical interpretation. And then, of course, it was Minkowski who later then gave the actual four-dimensional picture using new metric. So Einstein nowhere mentions 4D or anything like that, any kind of funny stuff going on with space-time, other than these dilations and contractions that he thought were to do with the different ways measurement standards more than anything. It's more of a conventionalist approach. So I don't know what Veselin's view is. It sounds like he's giving a almost just the standard view of how philosophers of space-time think about special relativity, which is this geometric explanation.
Yeah, it may sound like it, but since you're not familiar with it in detail, then I would, I would recommend looking at one of his books. He's published more than one book, and of course, there's a series that he's edited, right? But what he basically does in his books is he goes through the history of philosophy, right? So it gives the philosophical background to questions of eternalism and presentism. And then, so he takes a very historical approach, right? So covering all bases of the development of these ideas in physics and philosophy, right? And then the way that he deals with the dynamical explanations for the kinematic effects of special relativity are very detailed and rooted in physics. So he doesn't, at that point, he no longer invokes anything to do with the history of philosophy. So it's purely mathematical and based on knowledge of physics. I would say that I would say that his argument for time dilation, or his argument against the dynamical explanation of time dilation, is a lot more powerful. But that's just my own impression, because one could intuitively grasp, right, that you could get different measurements for the meter stick, right, for dynamical reasons of what are called deformations, right? So, but when it comes to time dilation, it's much more difficult for me to grasp how the dynamical explanation is going to work, but that's just my own intuition, which means nothing, right? But I think that for maybe most people would probably have the same degree of intuition on this. They'd be able to grasp the deformation, right, effects on a meter stick. But when it comes to time lapsing at different rates for two different objects, right, dependent on their velocity and mass, that's a greater struggle to understand and to explain, both for professional physicists and for a lay audience. I don't know if you want to take you want to try to tackle that.
Well, I mean, the standard way that Einstein explained it himself was using sort of radar time ideas, where you're bouncing beams of light from what. So it's how you conceive of measuring time dilation. So the way he conceived of it was using these light clocks.
Yes.
Right? We send a beam of light from, say, we're stationary on the platform. There's a train moving. We bounce it to something in the train, and it comes back. And then we compare that to the person doing the same thing with their torch, and it bounces and comes back. And we can see that there are going to be differences in time measurements. And I think you can have a similar intuition as you would with the space example if you think of it in this light clock approach, rather than looking at your wristwatch and just viewing it like that, in which case it doesn't really make much sense. So there are many ways of measuring time, of course, and maybe not all of them are intuitive in the same way as Einstein's original approach.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, intuition, at the level of intuition, and then above it slightly, of course. The most lay audiences will have the knowledge about how the GPS system works in your car, in an automobile, right? And so the fact of time dilation, right, it has to be fed into all of the computers in order to adjust, right, for the different time rates, which again, it's a subject that we could go on at length, but it would then consume the entire interview. All right, so that is, what are the pros and cons of the dynamical explanations, right, in contrast to basically the Minkowski, right, 4D model explanations, right? But in any case,
Yeah,
to get
I was just going to say something about.
yes, please,
I was
please.
going to say something about the block. Actually, I mean, so the standard view of this. So I suppose Vesselin would say something like, the three-dimensional descriptions are somehow less fundamental than the four-dimensional block, and the four-dimensional block is the real stuff, the invariant stuff. Is that where he goes with it?
Yes, and then he invokes Hermann Weill's famous statement about
Calling up the world line.
that's it. Yes, the
Yeah.
consciousness, right?
Yeah. So I used to be a block universe advocate, and for reasons going back to what you were talking about earlier with the pre-Big Bang
Mhm.
stuff of George Ellis and so on. I don't. I think it's a very bad way of viewing the world now, because it precisely removes those possibilities. And there's so the original terminology for the block universe comes from William James. You probably know this,
Yes, yes.
and he was sort of viewing it as um, this thing with no free play. There's no way of getting any sort of creation in that kind of block, because there's just necessity and impossibility, that you cannot get possibility in that kind of block world. So I favor something along the lines of Ellis's approach now, and a William James approach. And I don't buy this the Minkowski block view anymore, and the Hermann-Weyl view anymore, for that reason. And I even and it even relates to the hard problem of consciousness that you mentioned,
Mhm.
and the relationship between mind and matter, because a view I've been developing with Harold Atmanspacher. We have a recent book on dual aspect monism and the deep structure of meaning.
Mhm.
And in that, the approach is to start with this space of possibility, which is a kind of nothing, because there is nothing actualized. It's a kind of nothing, a philosopher's kind of nothingness.
Yes.
And the idea is that this is almost like an unus mundus, a kind of unified world. And it's through the splitting of this that you get the mind matter correlations. But they're not fundamental. The fundamental thing is this space of possibilities. And there are very many ways of splitting it, just like in Spinoza's
Mhm.
dual aspect quantum.
Yes.
So this is we call it decompositional. It's not like Bertrand Russell's, where you're building up features of the world from these neutral elements, these atoms. You start with everything. You start nothing, rather. You start with
Yes.
the totality, and you split. And then you get psychophysical correlations as a necessary consequence, because of the way you split it. Just like
Yes.
when you split a holistic quantum state in an entangled state, you get correlations by logical necessity. So we can sort of explain those correlations by where they're coming from this split.
Right. Right. So, well, that
So,
yes. Mhm. It reminds me of Max Velleman's reflexive monism. It's not the same, but I think it's congruent in many respects to a great
mm,
degree. And personally, I find it one of the most coherent models out there. Right, the whole notion that you start with a state, right? That, for instance, Wolfgang Pauli called this psychophysical. Right,
yeah,
one can modify the language however one wants to, but the basic concept, I believe, is the same. So you have this
mm,
unitary state that then undergoes some bifurcation, right? And it perhaps I think it has explanatory power also because it then opens the possibility for understanding certain phenomena that seem to simultaneously or in some integral way to exhibit the features of both nodes in that binary, right?
yeah,
So and in this case you sort of if I'm not mistaken, we start off with a monism but we end up with sort of a dualistic binary, right? A framework.
yes,
But I know dualism,
yeah.
that's a loaded term, right? But uh,
Well, yes. What's interesting about the particular approach we have is that it's both monist and dualist, but it's ontologically monist and epistemically dualist.
there, yes,
So the
yes,
split is merely epistemic.
right.
So yeah, it resolves a whole bunch of puzzles. And you're right that you can explain all sorts of features. You can explain things like synchronicities. So Pauli, one of the things we discuss in the book is the Pauli-Jung correspondence.
Yes.
And so Pauli was very much concerned, like Jung, with explaining synchronicities. So they adopted pretty much exactly this viewpoint. So
Mhm.
these are one of the chapters of the book, right? The idea, and they even Pauli used the quantum mechanical analogy. We
Yes.
find the same thing in David Bohm, who's been doing some work with Basil Hiley. where again it's the same concept. The language changes slightly. So Bohm speaks of the implicate order, which is basically again this space of possibilities. There's no
Yes.
thinghood or anything like that, but it's not a state. There's a sort of process involved in Bohm's view of how we get from implicate order to what we find manifested in the explicate order.
Yes.
And he calls this hollow movement. So he builds up a whole new set of terminology and so on, but it's exactly the same viewpoint. There's a
Yes.
totality, you split it, and you get what's manifest. And there's always a subject, and there's always an object reflecting it. And in this way, you can. I mean, there are two ways of solving that problem you mentioned earlier of the relationship between the mind and the matter. There's either a cyclic view, which is also quite interesting, I think, where each is bringing the other into existence. So one of the other people we consider in the book is John Wheeler and Eddington, who have this view that there's a process going on where, in asking questions of the world, you're playing some role in bringing about what actually happens objectively. But by the same token, that objective structure is determining your particular nature and what happens to you. So he calls it a meaning circuit. Each is sort of building the other in this circuit. Eddington has a kind of similar idea where he thinks that what we're doing when we're doing science and doing measurements of the world is basically almost a kind of self-analysis, right? We're observing, we keep finding our own footprint basically whenever we're doing scientific research. We've put it partially there. So there's either a cyclic view or you have this fundamental thing, and it emerges from the split.
So the cyclic, could you also call that sort of a loop process?
Yeah, it's
mutually reinforcing loop process. Like that brings to mind, the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer, neo-Kantian, his theory of language, and well, in his book Language and Myth, but his theory of the relationship between language and consciousness, that they mutually reinforce each other. And looking at it from a linguist point of view, a cognitive point of view, right? Human consciousness is quite complex, but we see that it sort of runs parallel to the complexity of our ability to produce speech, right? And the complex grammar and syntax. And so, for instance, what is thought, right? It seems to me, I know some will disagree, but my own personal experience is that thought for me is just an unspoken speech. And Chomsky would say that the thought process, together with spoken speech, those are both outward parts of the language system. The inward is not the silent thought, is not human ability to think, but is what we could call the unconscious, or some may perhaps call the subconscious. But that is what is totally hidden and inaccessible to us. And so the outward part of language is the silent thought and speech. And now he doesn't necessarily agree with my idea that this silent speech is necessarily grammatical or syntactical. It is for me, but for him, he says, for him, that's largely imagistic and other types of non-verbal, non-audible speech. But
I suppose it would depend on your training. I mean, I think there are various different ways of getting a bit lower into that subconscious. And in each case, it's a different set of symbols. This relates to the Cassira approach. You're using a different set of symbols if you're a musician, for example. You can get a bit closer. You can use dreams to probe a bit further down, or poetry, or art, or some sort of religious experience. In each case, you're just trying to get a little bit further down.
Yes.
By jettisoning conceptual content, which is sort of a bit more related to this split between subject and object. So the more you get rid of this conceptual content, the closer you're getting down to this totality. But I don't think you can ever get there, ever.
Yes.
Because
well,
You can't
yeah, the
ever
way, yeah.
experience it or know it.
Right, right. But
Yeah.
there's never a direct access, even though we can't. There are certain techniques, as you've mentioned, that can sort of activate data in the unconscious to sort of come up
Mm.
to higher levels, and then we can grasp it. I mean, I know Einstein, and I think Newton also had this little trick they used with the coin when they weren't able to solve a certain problem. Right, they would
Mm.
sit down and go to sleep, and when they would holding a
Mm.
coin, right,
Would
and
drop, yeah.
when it dropped, it wake
Mm.
them up, and chances are they would have the solution and they could write it down and then go to sleep.
Yeah.
But the point I was making about the mutually reinforcing loop is Cassir's idea that as language develops, as it becomes more complex, so the ability, so consciousness also becomes more complex. And so they reinforce
Mm.
each other. And then, of course, you
Yeah.
can look at it from the point of the view of the question, which came first. But I think that the answer to that question is the model that you're developing, actually. I mean, the general type of model, and that is you have to start off with something that is more primary than the two nodes of that binary
Yeah.
from which both
Yeah.
nodes emerge, right? And so that's the real interesting question, philosophically. I think scientifically as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, going back right to the beginning, the thing that we are talking about, which was this problem of trying to explain why there's something rather than nothing.
mhm,
Leibniz makes pretty much the same point that you're making here, which is that you can't try and explain what the manifest reality from within the manifest reality. So you can't try and explain the thing you're explaining using that very thing that you're trying to explain. So you have to go find it elsewhere. It's unless you do a circuit.
yes, well, the way I like to describe this is through analogy, right? So because of the physical structure of our eyes, our retina, cornea, and all this, when at night we look at a particularly low magnitude star, if we look at it directly, it fades from our field of vision. So we have to look at it on the periphery, and it comes into view.
Mm.
And so certain ways of reasoning are analogically similar. That is, sometimes if we try to solve the problem head on directly through our what would be called ratio, right? Um, we can't tackle it. So we have to find some other way of approaching it,
Mhm.
and that would be some indirect way, right? And there are all sorts of indirect ways. Even mathematics can be an indirect way
Yeah.
of trying to tackle some of these hard cognitive, because the structure of our thinking is binary, and we can produce syntheses, of course. That's a fundamental basis of logic, right? But
Mm.
at the same time, even when we achieve syntheses, it's still within a binary system, right? And
Mhm.
so we're really not. I don't believe we're really getting to the more primary state from which our ability to operate in this binary state of cognition emerges. And so
Mm.
this is one of the reasons too that I think we start hitting a cognitive or epistemological block, right, when we go back to the origins of everything, because thought, uh, which is sort of a mirror of language and vice versa, are
Mm.
thought and language are totally bound within the categories and the boundaries of space and time. So
Yeah.
it's basically a spatial temporal tool that we use. And so if we then ask, well, what comes before the beginning? Now we're alluding to something that is actually beyond those barriers. And so we can't think about it. We can't think about
Yeah.
it, at least not directly. Right.
Yeah.
And so here is where the miracle, quote unquote, of like logic, right, comes into service, right? That's seemingly can stretch those limits within
A
the
little bit.
limitations.
Yeah.
Is dialectical, I know,
Mhm.
but it brings us back to Ellis's space of possibilities, right? Which I find incredibly helpful. In other words, I
Mhm.
think it's one of the most powerful explanatory models out there currently, right?
Mhm.
And I think most people can go along with him when he's talking about the laws of physics in that regard. Um, and also, I think even he talks about the possibility space of meaning. I think a lot of people could even go with him there, because if you set up this formula, all right, so morality does not equal ethics. So
Mhm.
there's a logical, well, there's a possibility space for morality, not to be confused with ethics. All right, so the possibility space of meaning. So the term meaning is not to be confused with many things it can be confused with, depending on the individual. For instance, he doesn't mean human ideas, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, Things that we attribute based on our cultures. Excuse me. So, what do you, how would, do you have an idea here of, could you help me with this? I've been struggling with it. All right. So, the possibility space of morality does not coincide with the possibility space of ethics. So when he says,
Mhm.
when he talks about the possibility space of meaning, that does not coincide with what?
I would imagine something like understanding, or I don't know. I mean, what's the standard thing that people think of when they think of meaning?
That's the
Something
issue.
like an assignment of a value of some kind, an assignment of
Yes.
a um, hmm, yeah. One thing means another thing.
Right. So this is really a question. What does Ellis mean by meaning when he talks about the
Mhm.
possibility space of meaning? So do you
Yeah, it's a
have a grasp
relation.
on
It's
that?
usually I'm not sure. I mean, it's usually a relation. The way we do it in the book I mentioned with Harold Atmanspacher. So the subtitle for that is "And the Deep Structure of Meaning." So the
Mhm.
way we view it is there is um, there is latent meaning in that space of possibilities, from which the split into subject and object is generated.
Mm.
But it's really hard because what you want to do is think in temporal terms and things emerging from another thing in a temporal sense. But it's this is something I really struggle with. Is this the point at which there's a split, the point at which possibility becomes actual, and the point at which meaning generates this relationship between an object and a subject? Because that's usually what we think of as meaning. There's an idea in the subject here of this object, and it's a relationship. So what we were trying to say was that no, this meaning is something that gives birth to that kind of a relationship, and it's a latent thing, and it's not relational. It's really hard to make it out. We went through a whole bunch of examples to do with non-conceptual content, going into Merleau-Ponty's intentional arc and things like this,
Yes.
to try and get a little bit beneath this usual subject-object split and still
Mhm.
find meaning there. Even Gibson's action perception cycles, whole bunch of possibilities for making sense of something like this.
Mhm.
And Pauli and Jung had a very similar idea where they speak of a latent meaning from which things like
Mhm.
synchronicities emerge and so on.
Yes.
But I agree. I have the same struggle trying to express this in any coherent way. I can sort of feel it more than I can say it.
Mhm.
It's very difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Well, because it immediately brings up the notion of consciousness, and not necessarily restricted to humans, but of course we are humans. So it brings up the notion of human consciousness and the relation of that to meaning. And so when I think of a possibility space for meaning, I connect with that. Probably I derive from it. So at a later stage, so something that becomes congruent with that initial setting would be how human consciousness is able to make relations which produce meaning for human consciousness, right from that very again, I can't explain this, but I have a feeling, I guess, like you do. I have this sort of intuition that is the question to ask here. What is the overlap in the pattern, right, between human consciousness being able to make relations which produce the meaning, or produce this feeling that we've achieved meaning,
Mhm.
with the pattern of the possibility space of meaning? Is there some structural similarity, right? Because you
Mm,
of course you can't start off with human consciousness, and that, right, this is before there's even anything concrete, which is necessary
mhm.
before the human consciousness arises. Maybe it depends, right? Because if you start with this monism model, as you are, or Vellman's does, it's
Mhm.
sort of implicit, or in Bohmian terms, it's implicate, right? It's implicit in there, and it's going to come out of that at some point. So there must be some continuity to explain, or to create the explanatory gap and to explain that, right? So we actually have an explanation, and not dare I say, an excuse, like, well, it just emerges, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever other explanations there are out there. And with all due respect, right? I'm not trying to belittle anyone,
Yeah.
uh, because I know everyone's putting a lot of effort into all of these different ideas, right? But
Mhm.
uh, if we do know this, right? So we have human consciousness, it's able to make relations, and that produces what we call meaning, or I would say meaningful relationships, which means coherent structure. Um, so how then could we work backwards to the possibility space of meaning? So is this experience we have with consciousness producing meaning, is it made possible by that possibility space? Is there a structure in there?
Yeah, that's what I want to say myself, but I haven't found a way of making sense of it. I've been trying to find ways, as I say, of getting lower and lower and lower
Mhm.
by thinking in terms of things like musical meter,
All
tonality,
right.
which don't seem to involve a they have this curious um, thing where they're neither quite subject nor object.
Mhm.
Similar to you can find a few other things like this, but it's this. If you can find things like that and still find some sense of meaning in there, then you're sort of getting closer to that structure that you're
Mhm.
speaking about. I'm trying to make sense of these. This is kind of the thing I'm thinking about now, and I
Mhm.
yeah, and I
It,
still
it,
haven't.
then it would seem to be moving away from spatial temporality. It's not escaping it, but it's moving
Yeah,
lower
it
down,
has to.
right, to where those are generated,
I mean,
right?
even Schopenhauer has something vaguely similar to this when he talks about music, and he says, in the end, as you're going down into absolute music, I mean, the key is in the word absolute there. You're getting rid of these relations between subject and object. You are basically approaching what is will, right? In the sense of this,
Mhm.
it's almost like a collective unconscious in his sense. This
Right,
this
right.
deeper layer of reality, but he doesn't try and explain what he means by
Uh,
that and what the structure of it is or anything like that. So he would
right.
be faced with the same problem. Okay, and the what happens, the miracle thing, the emergence thing. So
Mhm.
it's yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. I
Mhm.
don't know how to deal with this problem.
Well, I think it's easier to deal with the emergence of consciousness than, with what Schopenhauer is dealing with, which goes deeper, because that's
Mm,
how do we explain the unconscious? And of course, as you know, Vellman's has the metaphor, or the image of the iceberg, right? The 10% or so is above the water. That's our ego. That's our consciousness. And the
mm,
90% down there is what Jung would call the unconscious. Freud would probably call the subconscious. And he had many more terms for different layers there. But Vellman's has this intriguing um, way of phrasing the relationship between that 90% of the iceberg, which is submerged. All right. So what is supporting it? Well, in that model,
mm,
of course, you would call it the sea, right? But he tells me, and he has written this, right, that sea, that is the universe, right? So this is reflecting
mhm.
his idea that um, it's the Pauli model of the psycho material
Physics
world,
and nature.
basically. Yeah, the
Mhm,
monism, which then develops into this binary, um, and so that is compatible with, but I think it goes a lot further than Jung's collective unconscious, right? And it, even though it goes a lot further, actually, I think it. As a general system, it seems to be more coherent to me, at least personally. because
Mm.
because it makes more sense on a cosmological scale. I mean, right? So it's much more controversial, right, to describe the human unconscious as sort of this collective entity. There are arguments for and against it, but on a cosmological scale, it really seems coherent that you would
Hmm.
say this is the foundation, right, for everything that comes from it, which would include, right, subsets like, you know, human consciousness, and what is generating it, right, which is really inaccessible to us, that
Mm.
unconscious, right? And here's another question for you, which I also posed to Max. It sort of caught him off guard, but you'll see the relevance in a minute here. And that is, have you ever considered the relevance of, uh, um, how shall I phrase this, savant, um, what do we want to call them? Savants who have these,
Ability.
yes, these incredible abilities we do not have. For instance, right, Daniel Tammet can. There's a famous
Mm.
video of him, lasts like 5 hours, right, reciting the first
Yeah.
22,000 plus digits of pi, right,
Mhm.
and forgive me, I forget his name, but there's an Israeli
Yeah,
doctor who's.
the guy who does the drawings, perfect drawings of the cityscapes.
And
He
this
sees
one
them
as
once,
well,
goes and
another
draws
good
them.
example. Yes,
Mm.
yes. This has been likened to. I say, all right. So this is mind-boggling. How do we understand it? Well, we can start to understand it in this way: that the entire body, right, is part of an overall processing,
Mm.
thinking, conscious organism, right? So, a pianist who's performing the third piano concerto of Rachmaninoff live has not
Mhm.
memorized every single note of that concerto. You know, he
Oh,
has,
yeah.
but it's here, right? It's in
It's
the
in the
motor
body, yeah.
skills. It's in the body,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, a lot of this is at the quote unquote unconscious level. It's been
This is why
programmed.
I use music. This is why I use
Yes.
music as the example for that very reason.
Which is why it triggered my memory on this subject, and why I wanted to bring it up. Even though these examples are not confined to music, of course, as you say, also to art, right? And but even more spectacularly, there are these savants who, some of them are blind, and you can play
Mhm.
them classical music, and that they've never heard before, and they immediately play it with consummate skill. Uh,
Yeah.
and so that data, like the first 22,000 digits of pi, that is down there in the unconscious. And Alan Snyder, his theory is that these savants somehow have direct access to that data in the unconscious, whereas, of course, we don't. The
Oh,
non-autistic
yeah.
does not.
Don't usually. Don't usually.
Yes, but there are techniques, of course. Traditionally, there are many techniques of how to try to program the unconscious to release certain pieces of data up into higher levels where we can grasp it, like the coin
Mm.
trick that I mentioned earlier. But there are many more altered states of consciousness, types of chemicals, LSD, which that's also a good subject there, because what happens with LSD, for instance, is what also happens with certain techniques like meditation. That is, so instead of trying to increase the conscious, rational attempt to understand something, uh, the usual circuitry connections, right, in the neurotransmitters are now changing routes to more less traveled circuits, right? And so it's sort of like when you try to achieve the passive state, that's when you can find the answer, right? And
Mm.
so once you give up the intense rational attempt at, you know, trying to solve some mathematical problem or whatever it may be, um, that's when these
Yeah.
infrequent types of neural passageways begin to then reroute, and then, right, they connect and you get it. So it's actually a lower level of consciousness that actually gets you those answers that, you know, a higher level of consciousness, higher degree of concentration are not able to supply, right? So
Yeah.
could it be that, right, that this point, right, that savants illustrate to us that there is this incredible data available to us that seems superhuman, and some would even
Yeah.
say supernatural, right? But once you understand what's going on, right, it's completely natural, right? But down there in the unconscious realms, right, of our being, right, that is where we could potentially, right, have clues to solutions that have evaded us in the history of philosophy, and others. Like the hard problem of consciousness, right? There's a big debate between some more naturalistic ways of approaching this, and then the Mysterian, quote unquote, Mysterian school, like Chomsky,
Mhm.
right? In principle, we don't know, but it's a possibility that there's some things we may never be able to answer, given the fact that we are a human physical being with certain finite structures. A rat
Yeah.
reaches a limit cognitively, and so reasoning by
Yeah.
analogy.
I mean, look, so going back to falsifiability, it's something
All
that
right.
should be testable. Like so we're saying there are ways of dipping, and it's a prediction of the model, by the way, that in the book that I
Mm-hmm.
wrote with Harold Atterbacher, that there should be these exceptional experiences, we call them there. It's a prediction. And the problem is, as you mentioned, trying to find ways of getting into those states. But I suppose
Mm-hmm.
the savant syndrome cases could give you some clues by looking at what exactly is going on in their brain, trying to, because they can converse, you can get information. If you could figure out what kind of state they are getting into, if you can find any kind of clues of the state that they're in when they're in this, as you say, it's somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
It's very non-conceptual, very very deep. And then if you can find ways of mimicking this, then you should be able to have people practicing and drawing these same kind of skills up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think most people have had some kind of experience where they wonder where some idea came from or how they wrote a
Sure.
particular book or paper. It's as if you didn't quite write it because you were so intensely focused. At some points we get so intensely focused that it's not really you writing it. You're not there. You don't have awareness that you're there. So it might be, it's as good as something else writing it
Sure, sure. Often
through
I've
you.
had that experience like a pianist, but the words I'm typing are coming out of my fingers because
Yeah.
it's somehow, I've programmed a lot into the unconscious, and then that is being released without the necessity of consciousness. It's like some people who
Yeah.
drive
It,
for a while and
it's
they say,
pure
"Oh
body
my
again.
God, how
Exactly.
did I get home?"
Yeah. Yeah, so it's pure body, but words, what look like conceptual content, but it's not. The conceptual content doesn't live in there first, and then make its way out. It
Mhm.
comes out in the process of through the bodily processes.
Yes,
So,
yes.
interesting.
Uh,
I've never thought about it like that. Yeah,
Well, it's one of it's known as a Dr. Zinner question. I like to spring it on people from a lot of different fields because
mm,
certainly I do want to bring attention to people who are often neglected in society, or who may even be exploited. I think
mm,
savants sometimes I think are exploited for entertainment purposes, which I
yeah,
think is
mm,
certainly unethical or immoral. But I do like to bring attention to the experience of people that sometimes academics, including myself, don't usually neglect, and there may be things we can learn uh, from their experience
I
in the
mean,
world.
look, just to go back to the example of the memory. I
Mhm.
mean, that's a lot of things to memorize. We are being asked to suppose that those however many digits of pi are sitting in the brain. That's almost, I mean, that sounds less plausible than
Yes,
if it's being dragged from somewhere else.
yes.
It's being drawn from somewhere else.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, we do know that savants, do use some simple memory
Yeah,
techniques, right?
mnemonics. Mm,
For instance, with involving calendars, right? So
mm.
there are certain
Yeah,
mathematical
sure.
formulae that we know of and that that'd be easily done. But some of these other these other abilities, like the blind pianist playing Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto upon
Right.
first hearing it, or the 22,000 plus digits, right? These are not comparable. There is no formula, right?
I mean, another example, which is almost like a kind of induced savant syndrome, is where people have accidents
Yes.
and they may have a brain contusion or something like that, and then they can suddenly do these things. So something has
Yes.
happened. Maybe it's we usually, I don't know. This might be an explanation that it knocks out some conceptual element that allows them to be in a more filtered, less filtered state, or something like that. I don't
Mhm.
know. It'd be interesting to compare those.
Well, yeah, those abilities would seemingly, in principle, seem to be possible for anyone given the right
Mm.
brain structures or activities or states or whatever is going on right in the brain with that. Um, it's so it seems to be certainly not something that in principle you have to be born with, right? So it can develop
Mhm.
later, as you say, through various injuries. But but anyway, the principle behind the question, the goal of it is right. Is there a possibility that these people, right, can maybe give us clues about where to look next, right, to find some
Mm.
of these really difficult uh, questions. But in any case, a final question I have for you, which is generated by your earlier mention of Jung's and Pauli's synchronicity. Would you make a distinction between that, which is called synchronicity, and then uh, coincidences? Right. So right. For instance, if one knows, if one has been trained how to use a card deck for magic tricks, uh,
Mhm.
the untrained person, right, believes this is astounding, is magical, but it's really simple mathematical formulae that are being used, right? So a lot of astounding coincidences anyone may have in their daily life can really be explained by, just the nature of
Mm.
probability, looking at it from a statistical point of view. But so how do you distinguish or contrast between, something uh,
Well,
normal as a probabilistic, or I mean a probability statistical phenomenon, which is not all that astounding when you think of all the possibilities out there, probabilities out there, and what Jung and Pauli are calling synchronicity.
yeah. Well, I mean, I would distinguish it the same way that they distinguish it, which is there's a meaning component in there. It's not just that it's implausible or improbable. Its improbability comes from the fact that this has extreme meaning for you in that moment. So it's as if the world is behaving, the outer is behaving like the inner, rather
Mhm,
than the inner reflecting the outer, which is exactly what you should expect from the kind of model that I was mentioning with this dual
mhm,
aspect
mhm.
monism approach.
Right.
Obviously, the classic example is the scarab beetle, right? Where Jung was in
Mhm,
his office and he was going through some examples that involved the scarab beetle and renewing and how a death can be like a birth and these kind of things, and then a scarab beetle taps on the window and there's an example of them.
Sure.
It was improbable given the circumstances, far too improbable given the circumstances.
Yes. Well, yeah, I think every human being has probably had these types of experiences, and but
Mm.
a subset of that question, which gets to, I think, an even more fundamental question is, all right, so we have so maybe at a deeper level, may there be more of a connection between synchronicities and the non-meaningful but even astounding coincidences that we experience. So in other words, may both of those reflect some more underlying structure of existence, structure of the cosmos, that so in other words, maybe these, even what we demean by calling coincidence, just a coincidence, maybe this is also a manifestation of something that's really astounding in the universe, and that is
Yeah,
maybe the fact of that it's all structure, right? There's structure
yeah,
to and therefore the randomness, like in evolutionary biology, for instance, we see all the random parts of a sequence, right, sort of, and then encrypted within that, right, is the meaningful, productive, generative sequence, right? But so you can't do without the random, and it would seem that even the random can, when you step back and see it from a larger framework, be producing certain order and structure.
Yeah,
So
I
you
think
see
that's
where I'm getting at here?
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this is where I would differ from Jung and Pauli. So they view synchronicities as something rare and exceptional. I don't
Yes.
think they're rare at all. I think they're permanent. They're just continuously going on.
Mhm.
I think the world is built almost essentially from these synchronicities. The relationship between a subject and an object is a kind of synchronicity, a permanent synchronicity. So,
Mhm.
and I think one of his, I think it was one of Pauli's, maybe a secretary or a student, Maya, who had a similar kind of viewpoint that there's just permanent synchronicity,
Mhm.
which makes sense. I don't know why they would have said that it was a rare event, given how they define synchronicities. Maybe
Right.
because they didn't have this. Well, no, it doesn't make sense because Jung had this notion of latent meaning as well. So
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
know. Maybe they just didn't think this through
Well,
to this depth.
yes. Well, I'll give an example because I think coincidences, what Jung would call a coincidence, is well, it could even be an extraordinary case, but there's no real emotional charge, right, experienced
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
it,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
right. And I'll give an example. And I say every human being has these experiences. Recently, I was speaking with a colleague in Georgia, at Tbilisi, and by chance, I had happened to come across the name of a modern alchemist. Right, it's
Hmm.
not necessarily a topic I'm interested in, but I came across this story of this alchemist named Fulcanelli, and no one even knows if he actually existed. Right, so it has the tinges of urban legends. Right, um, so I asked my friend uh, the next day, have you ever heard of this Fulcanelli legend? And he said, I said yes. And so, well, when's the last time you've thought about Fulcanelli? This is 20, 30 years ago, right? So, all right. So the extraordinary coincidence was later that day, just hours later, a colleague of my friend emailed him and said and mentioned Fulcanelli.
Hmm.
And so
Yep.
that's actually why it's important to know that my friend does not regularly discuss Fulcanelli with his
Mm.
colleagues. So
Yeah.
he right.
I,
So I didn't experience it
I
as
have.
synchronicity, but it was mind blowing to me, probabilistically, statistically speaking. Right.
Oh yeah. I have absolutely. I have them all the time.
Yes. Hmm.
Lately. I had a similar one with. I had just stumbled across the name of an author, Olaf Stapledon, who
Hmm.
wrote this book Star Maker, which is apparently a classic. I'd never heard of him before. I get a new student who comes in, and almost one of the first things he says, we start talking about science fiction, and he mentions Olaf Stapledon out of the blue.
Hmm.
This was a recent one. I also noticed that you interviewed um, Tessa Dick on your channel. I was
Yes.
just trying to watch
Yes.
before
And
coming on. I was trying to watch it, and the exegesis. So suddenly, I've been going on about this exegesis to various people lately.
oh, really? Yeah.
Leslie Stein, there's a guy called Leslie Stein who you might probably want to get on your channel. He works on mystical experiences. He was a Jungian
Hmm.
he's a Jungian analyst. But I mentioned this book to him just very recently, and he thought it was like a kind of drug because he just got absolutely obsessed
Hmm.
with this
Hmm.
book. And there you are with a you know
Right.
one of
Right.
your
Right.
uh,
Well,
programs
I
on
put
X.
I put it in the category of popular culture, but that doesn't mean that I'm demeaning it, because that's popular culture is important to me.
Mm,
Entertainment, music, film, all of this, and I've dabbled in a lot of those fields myself,
mm,
and even at university, right? I became qualified in several different fields. I've just always had sort of interest in so many different fields. So I studied ancient literatures, languages, histories, museum administration, and I could go on, but that's not important. But so what my point is that I'm not demeaning that by putting it in a category of popular culture. That's very important. Beethoven for me is popular culture, right? And it also overlaps though with other fields, of course. Dick's work and the exegesis, right, goes into even information physics because
yeah, of course, it's not. It's a kind of Gnosticism plus information theory plus simulation theory
I
with
would
a sort of
guess,
hero's journey.
yes, I would guess he got his information model from Wheeler, I'm guessing. Since Wheeler was talking about the its and bits right back in the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. But
Yeah, you just reminded me of something. You
please go
reminded
ahead.
me of something I wanted to mention when you were talking about information earlier, and you mentioned Shaitin, who has this information ontology. And one of the mistakes I think he makes it as well. I'm not sure whether he's got a different view now. Is that we have this new approach, which is everything is information. It's becoming quite widespread in the quantum computation community.
Sure.
And they often mention Wheeler as, you know, the guy who sort of came up with this basic idea through his it from bit
Yes.
notion. What it leaves out, this it from bit idea, is precisely this element of meaning again. And Wheeler didn't intend it like this. Wheeler absolutely had what he called the observer participator as the central element. It's not it from bit. That doesn't leave you anywhere. That's just that's missing out this whole subjective side of the equation, which physics and science often does. But Wheeler's approach was, no, it's the observer that is putting meaning into these bits in the first place that makes them. So it's it bit and us that make it. It's not it from bit. It from bit's a very bad way of
Yeah.
sort of describing the information ontology, I think.
Well, actually, at this
Misses.
point, yes, Gregory does recognize that there's an explanatory gap between the two, and that's connected to the whole issue that I mentioned earlier, where he realizes the present predicament both sides are in, like the panpsychists, and then the opposite field, right? So, I mean, the opposite side. That is, from both angles, there remains an explanatory gap, right? And so he is aware of that, and he recognizes that is our current challenge in science, is to somehow bridge the two. But of course, Gregory's current emphasis for some time now has been less on the it's to the bits, but it's been on the whole question of algorithm, right? So,
Yeah.
right, so sort of I mean, that hasn't resolved the question either, but that's been his focus for a while, right? On applying information science and the whole concept of structure algorithms to biological evolution, actually. So that's what he's currently been interested in, though he still does cultivate an interest in sort of a neo-Pythagorean approach with full realization that there are the explanatory gaps in it.
Yeah.
And I think I would agree with him. I'm really impressed with the notion of structure. And that for me is maybe the essence of mathematics, right? It's this patterns and structure, and of how some type of structuring produces, right, what we find ourselves in, right, in the world. And so some principle of structure, I would call it Ellis's possibility space. This is really what I mean by structure. This possibility space has some kind of structure inherent or implied, or that it certainly emerges from it, right?
Yeah.
Determines.
Yeah. There's a recommendation that I've got to give you actually, which
Sure, sure.
would bring Ellis, the Arkani Hamed, Shaitan's work, and Tegmark's work all together in the same system, which is Stephen Wolfram's new work on his Rulliad. So the way he views the Rulliad is precisely this You start with it's basically the space of all possible rules or algorithms. And similarly to Arkani Hamed, by using these very simple permutation rules called term rewriting by computer scientists, which are basically the same kind of permutations, you generate structure very quickly. And by doing this in certain ways, you can generate general relativity, quantum theory, and so on, our fundamental theories, the structure of our fundamental theories. But he
Yes.
also puts in there an observer as a computationally bounded sampling device, essentially. So the reason why we see the world we do, where like there's this infinite possibility space and there's this little finite being that essentially has sort of transducers and is sampling its space from its particular perspective. And in order to get a full theory of physics, he thinks of it as a fundamental real theory of everything. You have to
Right.
put in this sampling system as well as part of the model. I think
Right.
I'm very interested in it. I'm working with one of his the people from his research group on this at the moment.
Well,
Very interesting.
Gregory Chaitin and Stephen Wolfram are actually, for the last several years, are very, very close professional friends. And so they're in constant dialogue, actually, including on this subject. So that is, yes, that is an approach that you can bring in all of these others, try to and integrate at least certain most notable aspects of their system in this regard, right? This question of information, number, structure, algorithm, right? And so the way Gregory phrases it is, right, according to Pythagoras, everything is number and God is a mathematician, right? But in this newer view, God is everything is algorithm and God is a programmer, right? So that's the metaphor, right? The analogy. That's the starting point. That's the starting point, and he is right in constant dialogue with Stephen, and who is someone I do want to try to do an interview with, maybe even at some point together with Gregory, because I think they make a great pair, and well, it's all really fascinating. But I guess to try to begin wrapping this up, I think the most promising starting point, right, is really Ellis's concept of a possibility space. And then the next step is some monistic structure from which the two nodes of a subsequent binary emerge. And so ontological monism and an epistemological dualism, as you phrase it, right? So I'm actually very fascinated and pleased to discover this part of your work, which I was not aware of. This is, if I had been, we would have started there. So anyway, I really appreciate your time. This has been very, very enlightening, and I'm sure everyone else has found this enlightening as well. And wish you all the best in your research and in life in general. And let's stay in touch, Dean.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was a good discussion.
Yes, thank you. And everyone else, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Be sure to subscribe and support the channel through Patreon or PayPal. Thank you. Goodbye.